Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The journey begins. The sun hung low over JFK International Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. Among the throngs of travelers weaving through the intricate maze of gates and kiosks stood Marcus Reed, a sharp-dressed man in his late 30s. Marcus, a charismatic and highly accomplished entrepreneur, was on the cusp of a historic milestone. From humble beginnings in a struggling neighborhood of Chicago, he had risen to become one of the most influential figures in global business. His journey had been defined by grit, determination, and a relentless refusal to let systemic obstacles hold him back. Today was supposed to mark a personal celebration for Marcus. Having just finalized the acquisition of a major airline, a deal months in the making, he was set to fly to London to meet his new executive team. The excitement of this monumental achievement, however, was tempered by exhaustion. The last few days had been a whirlwind of negotiations and late-night strategy sessions. Pulling a sleek leather carry-on behind him, Marcus made his way to the check-in counter. His tailored navy blue suit exuded understated confidence, and his polished demeanor attracted glances from passers-by. While others were caught up in the chaos of last-minute arrangements, Marcus moved with purpose. At the counter, he handed over his passport and ticket to the agent. "Ah, Mr. Reed," the woman said, her tone bright. "Welcome. I see you're flying business class today. You're all checked in. Have a great flight." "Thank you," Marcus replied, offering a polite nod as he collected his boarding pass. Printed in bold letters on the pass was 2A, business class. The unexpected encounter. After clearing security and making his way to the departure gate, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. He thought back to the countless sacrifices and setbacks that had punctuated his career. Growing up in a neighborhood where success stories were few and far between, Marcus had faced doubt from every direction. Teachers, peers, and even well-meaning family members had told him to temper his ambitions. But Marcus had never settled for mediocrity. His reverie was interrupted as the boarding process began. First-class passengers were called, followed by business class. Marcus joined the line, showing his boarding pass to the agent at the gate. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reed," the woman said with a courteous smile. Marcus returned her smile, stepping onto the jet bridge. The cabin was impeccably designed, with spacious leather seats and ambient lighting that created a serene atmosphere. Finding his seat, Marcus placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled in. A glass of champagne awaited him on the armrest, a small but welcome touch of luxury. He exhaled deeply, letting the exhaustion of the week begin to melt away. As the cabin filled with passengers, Marcus prepared to catch up on some emails, pulling out his tablet and connecting to the plane's Wi-Fi. He was midway through drafting an email when a voice broke through his concentration. "Excuse me, sir." Looking up, Marcus found himself face-to-face with a flight attendant. Her expression was professional, but carried an undercurrent of hesitation. "Yes?" Marcus asked politely. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again," she said, her tone cautious. Marcus raised an eyebrow but complied, handing over the pass. She studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "It seems there's been an error with your seat assignment," she said finally. "We'll need to move you to another section of the plane." "Another section?" Marcus repeated, a hint of incredulity creeping into his voice. "What kind of error?" She hesitated before responding. "This seat was double-booked. Unfortunately, we'll need to move you to economy." For a moment, Marcus was silent, stunned by the absurdity of the situation. He glanced around the cabin and noted that no one else seemed to be undergoing similar scrutiny. "I paid for this seat," Marcus said evenly, maintaining his composure. "And my boarding pass clearly indicates 2A." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her professional demeanor faltering. "I understand that, sir, but there's been a system error. We really need your cooperation." Marcus leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm not moving. If there's been an error, it's not mine." I suggest you find another solution." The firmness in his tone seemed to unnerve her. She nodded curtly and retreated to the galley, leaving Marcus to sit in uneasy silence. A closer look. The minutes stretched on, and Marcus could feel the weight of other passengers' glances. Some were curious, others pretended not to notice. Marcus had experienced moments like this before, moments where his presence in spaces traditionally dominated by others was questioned. Despite his success, there were still places where he had to prove he belonged. The flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by the cabin manager. The man wore a crisp uniform and carried an air of authority. "Good evening, sir," the manager began, his tone measured. "I understand there's been some confusion about your seat." "There's no confusion on my end," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm in 2A, as indicated on my boarding pass." The manager sighed. "We're dealing with a full flight, and this seat appears to have been mistakenly assigned to 2 passengers. We'd appreciate it if you could relocate to economy. Of course, we'll compensate you for the inconvenience." Marcus's patience was wearing thin. "With all due respect, that's not acceptable. I purchased this seat, and I have every right to stay here. If there's a problem, it's on your end, not mine." The manager hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to pushback. "I understand your frustration, but we need to resolve this issue quickly." "Please, sir." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not moving. If you need to resolve this, do so without displacing a paying customer who is sitting in the seat he was assigned." The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, and a few murmured among themselves. A surprising revelation. Before the manager could respond, a younger flight attendant approached. Her expression was calm but determined. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the manager. "May I take a look at the passenger list?" The manager handed her his tablet reluctantly. She scanned through the document quickly, her eyes narrowing as she read. "Mr. Reed's seat wasn't double-booked," she announced after a moment. "There's been no error. He's exactly where he's supposed to be." The manager's face flushed, and he stammered an apology before retreating. The younger attendant turned to Marcus, her expression apologetic. "I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding, Mr. Reed," she said. "Please enjoy your flight." Marcus nodded but said nothing, the weight of the incident settling over him like a cloud. As the plane prepared for takeoff, he resolved to focus on the task ahead. He wasn't just a passenger on this flight. In a matter of days, he would be the owner of the airline. And when that moment came, he would ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had just experienced. The true weight of power. The soft hum of the airplane's engines grew louder as the plane ascended into the sky, cutting through the clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The night had fully settled over the city below, and the lights of New York were now distant, tiny glimmers in the vast expanse. Marcus Reed, still sitting in his business-class seat, tried to shake off the irritation that had clung to him since the incident. The flight attendant had apologized, and the cabin manager had retreated with a red face. The matter had been resolved, at least on the surface. But the bitter aftertaste of being treated as an outsider, despite his hard-earned position, lingered. He couldn't quite put it into words, but the feeling was like being a ghost in a room full of people who couldn't see you clearly. It wasn't new. He'd faced the same type of subtle discrimination countless times in his life, often in places that, on paper, were supposed to be symbols of success and equality. It wasn't just about the seat, or the flight attendant's misunderstanding. It was the implications, the idea that he wasn't truly meant to be in those spaces, no matter how much he had achieved. The irony of it hit him as the plane leveled off, cruising through the darkened sky. He was on his way to oversee an acquisition that would change the future of the very airline he was flying with. In a few days, he would become the owner of the company, and this would be his domain. He would have the power to reshape the culture, the policies, and the attitudes that ran through the very veins of the business. And yet, here he was, a man who had built an empire from the ground up, being treated like a second-class citizen on a flight he had paid for. Marcus had known that owning the airline would be a powerful step in his career, but now, it took on a different dimension. It wasn't just about the deal or the bottom line. It was about control over his own narrative, control over the spaces he could occupy without feeling like an interloper. A lifetime of struggles. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the gentle motion of the plane to ease his mind. The life he had lived, the battles he had fought, played out like a film reel in his mind. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had always felt the weight of being an outsider. As a child, he had been told that his dreams were too big and too unrealistic for someone like him. Teachers had questioned his ambition, friends had teased him for trying to rise above his roots. And even within his own family, there was a quiet belief that people like them didn't make it to the top. But Marcus refused to be defined by the limitations others imposed on him. He'd worked tirelessly, excelling academically and later in his career, outpacing those who doubted him. But even as he climbed the ladder of success, the quiet prejudices of the world never fully let him go. At first, it had been the casual dismissals in meetings, the raised eyebrows when he entered a boardroom, the faint but ever-present idea that he wasn't supposed to be there. Then, as his business empire grew, so too did the challenges. As a black man in corporate spaces, the obstacles were not always overt, but they were insidious. Whether it was being passed over for promotions or being questioned about his credentials in ways his colleagues never were, Marcus had learned to navigate a world that often didn't want him to succeed. Now, sitting in his seat on this flight, looking out at the stars through the window, he understood something deeper about the fight he had been waging. It wasn't just about his success. It was about paving the way for others. For the young black boy growing up in a neighborhood like his, who had dreams but no role models to show him the way. For the women and men of color in boardrooms who felt invisible or unseen, no matter how much they contributed. For the people who had been told their entire lives that they didn't belong in certain spaces. Marcus wasn't just on a flight to London. He was on a mission to change the game. The airline wasn't just a company he had acquired, it was a symbol of what was possible when someone who looked like him reached the very top. The revelation on the ground. The soft light of the overhead cabin lamp flickered slightly as Marcus adjusted his seat and tried to refocus. He felt the weight of the future pressing down on him. He thought about the work he had left to do, the merger was only the beginning, and now, he had a duty to transform the very culture of the company he was about to own. The flight attendants had begun their rounds, offering drinks and snacks, and Marcus absently sipped his water, his mind racing through the logistics of his upcoming meetings. But then, as if on cue, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice that was far too familiar. "Excuse me, Mr. Reed, can I speak with you for a moment?" It was the same flight attendant who had first approached him. Marcus tensed, but he didn't let his frustration show. The young woman who had apologized earlier had left him alone, so why was she here again? "Yes," he asked, his voice cool, but curious. "I just wanted to apologize again for the misunderstanding earlier," she said, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to upset you, and I just wanted to make sure everything is okay now." Marcus studied her for a moment. There was no malice in her eyes, no sign of contempt. She genuinely seemed to want to make things right, and in that moment, he realized that she was simply part of a system, one that was often more rigid and inflexible than anyone intended. "It's fine," he replied, offering a small, polite smile. "But it's more than just an error in seating. It's a reminder of how sometimes people like me are overlooked." "I get it, but it doesn't make it right." The flight attendant blinked, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of realization in her eyes. She nodded, a sincere look of understanding crossing her face. "I'll make sure to speak with my colleagues," she said softly. "Thank you for being patient with us." As she walked away, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this moment would be a turning point for her. People like him had been speaking out against injustice for years, but change was never quick or easy. Yet, every small conversation, every instance of awareness, helped move the needle forward. And then, a new thought hit him, what if this was the start of something bigger? What if, as the owner of this airline, He could lead by example and create a culture of inclusivity that wasn't just performative but embedded in every part of the business. The idea was exhilarating. Changing the airwaves. As the flight continued its smooth journey, Marcus's thoughts turned inward. His mind began to work with the ideas he had been harboring for months. He had always been an innovative leader, but now, as the future owner of a global airline, his influence could be far-reaching. There was so much work to be done. First, there was the rebranding of the company. He wanted it to stand for something more than just luxury travel. It needed to be a beacon of empowerment, of diversity, and of inclusivity. He envisioned a corporate culture that celebrated the rich tapestry of human experiences rather than perpetuating the outdated and exclusionary norms that had plagued the aviation industry for so long. As he worked through these thoughts, the excitement began to rise again. This wasn't just business, it was personal. His story, his identity, and his vision were now intertwined with the future of this airline. He wasn't simply flying to London as a businessman. He was on a mission to create a legacy, one that would inspire future generations to believe that no dream was too big, no seat too far out of reach. The plane began its descent into London, and Marcus knew that when he landed, he would be stepping into a new chapter. His legacy as a businessman would be sealed, but his true work, his true mission, was just beginning. The legacy he would leave behind. As the plane touched down at Heathrow Airport, the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sprawling city below. Marcus Reed, now fully awake, looked out of the window with a quiet resolve. The past few days had been a whirlwind, an emotional roller coaster that had left him both exhausted and energized. He had fought for every inch of success, faced every barrier, and now, as he stood on the precipice of a monumental change in his career, he could feel the weight of his journey in every fiber of his being. But more than that, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The seat incident, as frustrating as it had been, had awakened something in him that he hadn't quite realized was missing, a deeper, more personal mission. The moment he had stepped onto the plane in New York, he hadn't just been a businessman traveling on an ordinary flight. He had been a man on a mission to change the world in ways that extended far beyond boardrooms and mergers. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that his true legacy wouldn't just be written in the numbers of his balance sheets or in the stock reports of his acquisitions. It would be etched in the stories of those who would follow in his footsteps, who would see him as proof that the system could be changed, that their dreams were possible, and that no one could tell them where they belonged. A day of revelation. After landing in London, Marcus made his way to the company headquarters. As he stepped into the glass and steel skyscraper that would soon bear his name, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But this time it was different. He wasn't walking into this space to simply claim his place as a powerful businessman. He was walking in as a visionary, a man who would leave a mark not only on the aviation industry but on the way the world saw leadership, diversity, and inclusion. The meetings began almost immediately. Investors, board members, and executive staff filled the conference room, all eager to hear from the new owner. But as they went through the motions of introductions and discussions about company growth, Marcus knew that he had to speak his truth. This was his moment, the one he had been working toward for years. When it was his turn to address the room, he stood up with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat and began to speak. "I didn't come into this company just to own it," Marcus started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't spend my life building this empire to simply climb higher and higher. I came into this company to change it, to change the way business is done. To ensure that every person who walks through these doors knows that they belong here. To make sure that when people see me sitting at the head of this table, they don't just see a businessman. They see a man who has fought to open doors for others." His words hung in the air, powerful and deliberate. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his message settle in. "I've fought for every step I've taken in my life," he continued. "And I know that for many of you in this room, you've had your own struggles. But I believe in the power of leadership that is inclusive, that is fair, and that acknowledges the value in every person. We have the power to change the future of this airline, and it starts with changing the culture. As he spoke, he saw a subtle shift in the room. The stares from his colleagues, which once had been filled with skepticism or indifference, were now filled with respect. They could sense the change in him, the fire that burned within him to reshape an industry that had long been resistant to change. He could feel their perceptions of him shifting, from the outsider, the unqualified, to the leader who would shape the company's future. Building a new future. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly to implement his vision for the company. His approach was unconventional, but it was exactly what the airline needed. He focused on creating a culture that would reflect the diverse and dynamic world in which it operated. From the top down, the company would reflect inclusivity. No longer would people of color, women, or anyone who didn't fit a certain mold be overlooked. He wanted the airline to be a beacon for innovation, excellence, and equality, both in the air and on the ground. But Marcus knew that change wasn't something that could happen overnight. It wasn't just about changing a company's policies or firing certain people. It was about shifting mindsets. It was about giving employees the freedom to express themselves, to bring their whole selves to work without fear of judgment or discrimination. He initiated workshops on cultural competency and created platforms for employees from all backgrounds to share their experiences. Slowly, but surely, the company culture began to change. Perhaps the most significant shift came when the airline launched its first diversity initiative, which Marcus personally championed. It wasn't about fulfilling a quota or meeting a target. It was about truly reflecting the world around them, about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race or background, felt like they belonged when they stepped onto a plane operated by his airline. The moment of truth. 1 year after Marcus took ownership of the airline, he was invited to speak at a global business conference. The invitation had come not only because of his success, but also because of the changes he had made in his company, changes that were now being noticed and celebrated worldwide. As he stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of faces, he reflected on everything he had overcome. The challenges, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, all of them had led him to this point. But it wasn't about him anymore. It was about the impact he had made, the doors he had opened, and the future he was helping to shape. Success, Marcus began, his voice carrying through the room, isn't measured by the number of deals you close or the money in your bank account. Success is measured by the difference you make. Success is measured by the lives you change and the opportunities you create for those who come after you. He paused, letting his words sink in. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like you don't belong. But I also know that we all have the power to rewrite the narrative. We all have the ability to change the world in ways we never thought possible. And it starts with believing in yourself, even when others don't. It starts with having the courage to fight for your place at the table. The room erupted in applause. But it wasn't the applause that mattered. What mattered was the message. The one that would resonate with everyone in that room, everyone watching from afar, and everyone who had ever felt overlooked or unworthy. A legacy of empowerment. As Marcus left the stage, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't known in a long time. This wasn't just about the company, the contracts, or the power he held. This was about something much bigger. This was about creating a future where everyone, no matter their background, felt like they belonged. In the years that followed, his airline became a symbol of transformation, one that inspired companies and industries worldwide to rethink their own cultures. Marcus had not only changed an industry. He had changed the game. As he looked out at the horizon from his office window years later, he knew that he had achieved something far greater than any business deal could offer. He had built a legacy of inclusion, of empowerment, and of hope. And as the sun set once again, casting a golden hue across the horizon, Marcus Reed smiled, knowing that he had not only secured a place in the history books but had ensured that countless others would now have the chance to write their own stories, just as he had written his.